Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The house my parents gave my brother was not the present they bragged about. It was a bill they planned to hand to me the moment the applause died down. I remember sitting there at the so-called family gathering, with balloons tied to the mailbox and everyone clapping as Tyler jingled a brand new set of keys, while my parents kept repeating how proud they were to do this for him, as if he had just cured cancer instead of barely holding down a sales job that changed every 6 months. At first, I told myself not to roll my eyes, because I had grown used to their favoritism long ago, but then the next day came, and that is when the strings attached to this so-called gift started to choke me. The phone call from my mother did not start with a thank you for attending, or even a comment about how nice it was to see me. It started with, "Honey, we need a small favor from you. Nothing complicated, just your signature." She made it sound like she was asking me to sign a birthday card, when in reality, she meant co-signing a loan that would roll together Tyler's credit cards, his car, and some mysterious, unexpected repairs on the house they had just handed him like a trophy. She framed it as an investment in family equity, as though my name and my credit were merely tools to polish up his new start. I stayed quiet while she rattled on, nodding to myself because I knew if I said no too quickly the guilt storm would come crashing in, but I could feel my stomach turn. That night I logged into my credit monitoring app out of instinct, and sure enough there was a fresh hard inquiry already sitting there, dated the very day after the housewarming, under a lender's name I had never heard before. No one had asked me, no one had warned me, and my mother's "just sign it when it comes" suddenly looked a lot more like "we already pushed the paperwork and hoped you would not notice." I sat in my kitchen, half tempted to drive over and scream, but instead I did something quieter and far more effective. I froze my credit across all 3 bureaus and placed fraud alerts on my file. That way, even if they tried to slide my name onto something, it would trigger alerts and stall the process until I personally approved it. When I called my father the next evening, he used his calm, reasonable dad tone, the one he always put on when he knew they had crossed a line but wanted me to play along anyway. He said things like, "It is only temporary, you will not even feel it, we will refinance in 6 months and you will be off the hook." The words were smooth, almost rehearsed, but I had heard versions of them before, when they borrowed money from my college fund to help Tyler get on his feet, money that magically never returned. I told him flat out that I would need to review the documents before I signed anything. He hesitated for a second, and then said, "Of course, no rush, we trust you," which sounded more like, "We already assumed you were in." The next morning, an email arrived with a neat little digital packet, my name already typed into the cosigner field as though the decision had been made without me. There was even a space with a scrawled version of my signature that looked suspiciously similar to the one on my driver's license, only sloppier. It was not just presumptuous, it was dangerous. I did not scream, I did not even call them. I hit forward and sent it straight to the lender's compliance desk, attaching a note that said I had not authorized this application and that no lender was to proceed with my name attached without my written consent. I marked the calendar for a call with their fraud department later that afternoon, and only after that did I text my parents that I would look things over. Inside, I was boiling. The rage was not only about this one request, it was about the entire pattern that had been carved into my life since I was old enough to understand what fairness meant. Tyler got the car, the bailouts, the boys will be boys excuses, while I got lectures about responsibility and how girls needed to be practical. Seeing that packet with my name already typed in was like a neon sign flashing. They had no respect for my boundaries. They had already made the decision that I would clean up Tyler's mess whether I agreed or not. I promised myself in that moment that this time, I would not just say no, I would make sure the answer could not be twisted into yes. So I froze my credit, I built a paper trail with the lender, and I waited. The satisfaction was not loud or dramatic, it was quiet and controlled, but it was the first move in a game I had no intention of losing. They thought they had me cornered with family guilt and urgency, but what they did not realize was that the very act of trying to sneak my name onto those documents gave me leverage I had never had before. I sat at my desk, packet open, compliance email sent, and thought to myself, If they wanted to make me part of Tyler's house story, I was going to write my own ending, one they would not see coming. And then, just as I started to believe I had bought myself time, another notification popped up, a message that suggested they might already have tried to push my so-called consent through. That was the moment I knew this was only the beginning. I should have known that the polite silence I'd gotten from my parents after I asked for time to review the documents wasn't actually silence at all. It was just the eye of the storm, a brief lull before they launched their full-blown guilt campaign. Layered with emotional landmines, veiled threats, and nostalgic manipulation that made me feel like I was the one tearing the family apart, not the one trying to protect herself from being legally shackled to someone else's chaos. It started with a group text from my mother, cheerful, overly cheerful, saying how excited she was to see us all again at Tyler's second housewarming, a little dinner she said he was planning to thank everyone who helped him build his new chapter. There was no direct mention of the loan, or my name, or the signature I had refused to give, but the message carried a weight that told me exactly what this dinner was really about. It was going to be a stage, and I was going to be put on it, whether I liked it or not. When I showed up, deliberately late and with nothing but a polite smile, I already knew the tone of the evening. Tyler greeted me with that smug, performative enthusiasm he always turned on when he was trying to pretend everything was fine, even when he was bleeding debt and ducking phone calls. The house looked even more polished than I remembered, which made me wonder exactly where the money was coming from, because last time I checked, my brother didn't have the kind of credit that got you stainless steel appliances and imported tile. The dining table was already set with wine glasses and gold-trimmed plates, and my father stood by the kitchen island like he was the one hosting, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who thought he'd pulled off a masterful trick. And then came the moment that made it clear, the moment I had been dreading, when my mother tapped her glass with a spoon and asked for everyone's attention so Tyler could say a few words. He didn't thank me directly, but he didn't need to. He made some vague comment about family support and people who really believe in me when it counts, and then looked right at me like he expected me to stand up and accept the imaginary award for Most Manipulated Daughter of the Year. I didn't plan to speak, but the way everyone turned their heads and smiled at me like I had already agreed to something lit a fuse in me I could no longer ignore. I stood up slowly, held my glass empty, of course, and said something that, in hindsight, may have been a little too sharp, but felt absolutely necessary at the time. I said, well, here's to the people who believe in family so much they're willing to co-sign for decisions they weren't even part of. To anonymous generosity, and to reading the fine print before you sign your life away. Then I smiled, sat down, and watched the room freeze. The silence was glorious and awkward and heavy with unspoken panic, but no one had the guts to challenge me outright. My mother's smile faltered, my father cleared his throat like he wanted to say something but thought better of it, and Tyler laughed, that fake laugh he does when he's trying to act like he's not furious, before raising his glass and saying, spoken like a true lawyer. I didn't bother correcting him, because if they were going to assign roles, I was happy to play the one who knew how to find loopholes and kill bad deals. Later that night, after I left early and ignored the half-hearted calls from my parents, I got an email that made me want to throw something. It was a follow-up from the lender, the same lender I had already flagged for compliance, with a pre-filled signing request that now included a digital signature that looked disturbingly like mine. Not identical, but close enough that someone might believe I had clicked through the process in a rush. It wasn't just aggressive, it was fraudulent. I felt a kind of cold settle over me, the kind that comes when you realize people you've known your whole life are willing to pretend you're complicit just to make their mess easier to clean up. I forwarded the email, again, to the fraud department, this time with a screen recording attached showing that I hadn't opened any prior links and certainly hadn't typed or signed anything. I also copied in a second contact I'd gotten from the lender's compliance office, someone named Anita who had told me during our first call to document everything and keep records, because in her words, when family's involved, we see a lot of these. The worst part wasn't the forged signature or the boldness of it all. It was the way my mother called the next morning, not to apologize, but to lecture me about tone. Not ethics, not legality, not even the fact that someone had faked my name to fast-track a loan, just the tone of my toast. She said it made people uncomfortable, that I had embarrassed Tyler and undermined all the progress he's made, and that if I had concerns, I should have spoken to them privately. I said, calmly and clearly, that the only thing that had embarrassed anyone was the fact that they had treated my identity like an extension of Tyler's bank account. And then, right before she hung up, she slipped. She said, "We already moved your college money once to help him get started. This is no different." It hit me like a truck. The college fund. The one they told me got wiped out by a market dip. The one they said was just gone. It wasn't gone. It was moved. For him. Again. And this wasn't a lone cosign. It was just the next phase in a long, deliberate history of taking from me to build him up. So I didn't cry. I opened a blank document and started typing everything out, every date, every text, every email. Because now I knew this wasn't about one house or one loan or one lie. It was about the whole foundation they had built and how it had been tilted from the start. And if they thought I was going to let them keep building on my name, they had no idea what was coming next. There's a moment, and I think anyone who's ever been betrayed by family knows exactly what I mean, when the weight of what you've suspected all along suddenly hardens into certainty, and it stops being about emotion and starts being about proof, and that shift, that cold clarity, is when everything changes, because once you move into facts, there's no way back to pretending it didn't happen. For me, that moment was sitting alone with my laptop, rereading the email from the lender with the forged signature, while my mother's voice replayed in my head, not the guilt trip or the lecture about tone, but that one line she let slip. About moving my college money once, for Tyler, like it was nothing, like it had always belonged to the collective pool of family resources to be distributed according to need, and, somehow, his needs always came first, while my goals were treated like luxuries they couldn't afford. I started with the obvious, because when you grow up being told you're too sensitive or too serious, you learn to rely on paper, not memory. I pulled my credit reports from all 3 bureaus again, checked every inquiry and flagged every line I didn't recognize, and filed another identity theft complaint just to make sure there was a formal record on file, because I had learned the hard way that silence is interpreted as permission. Then I called the lender, not the friendly rep from earlier, but the compliance officer I'd spoken to before, the one who had already marked my file as suspicious. I told her, calmly and without any drama, that I was formally requesting a full copy of the application file, including all metadata, IP logs, timestamps, and anything showing where and how my signature had been applied. She didn't sound surprised. In fact, her tone shifted from professional to something closer to concerned, like maybe she had seen enough of these cases to know what was happening and that I wasn't the first daughter dragged into something like this. With her help, I confirmed what I suspected. The signature had been applied using a digital form sent to a different email address than mine, and later merged with the official packet using a linked profile that wasn't mine but matched Tyler's IP address. It was clumsy, obvious even, but enough to give the appearance of my consent if I hadn't caught it. That alone would have been enough to file a formal fraud complaint, but I wanted more, not just to block the loan, but to understand how deep this manipulation went and how long they'd been playing me without even flinching. That's when I dug into the county property records. It's public information, free to search if you know where to look, and what I found didn't surprise me, but it still made me feel nauseous. The house, the one they gave to Tyler as a gift, had a second lien on it, not huge, but significant, recorded just days after the title transferred. The lien was filed by a private lender who specializes in high-risk debt consolidation, which meant Tyler's financial situation was probably worse than anyone let on, and instead of telling the truth or asking for help like an adult, he and my parents had patched the hole with borrowed time, and now they were trying to drag me into the sinking ship under the pretense of family support. Even worse, attached to the lien documents was a gift letter, the kind you use during mortgage underwriting to show that a transfer of assets isn't a loan, signed by both of my parents, stating that the house was a no-strings-attached contribution to their son's future. No mention of shared responsibility, no contingency plan, no expectations for anyone else to step in. Just a clean, legal declaration that they were giving him the house, full stop. That document became Exhibit A in what I was now building, not a confrontation, not an argument, but a case file. I pulled out an old thumb drive I hadn't touched in years and found something I'd nearly forgotten about, emails from when I was applying to colleges, back when I still believed the college fund they talked about was real. There it was, plain as day, my mother explaining that due to the downturn, they would have to delay access to the fund, and a follow-up message months later saying they had reallocated some resources temporarily to help Tyler cover an urgent opportunity. Those words, urgent opportunity, haunted me, because back then I'd convinced myself it must have been serious, maybe even life or death, and I'd told myself I was being mature by understanding. But now, looking at the dates, the amounts, and what I knew about Tyler's history, I realized what that urgent opportunity really was. It was his third attempt at launching a dropshipping business. That never even broke even, and I had deferred my future so he could play CEO for 6 months with my tuition. That was the moment I stopped feeling bad about anything. So I compiled the timeline, the gift announcement, the lender inquiry, the forged signature, the second lien, the gift letter, the emails, and finally, the credit damage I had narrowly avoided by catching it all in time. I put it all in a clean PDF, labeled it with dates and summaries, and sent it to my attorney friend Sandra, not for legal action yet, but just to have a neutral eye look it over and tell me if I was overreacting. She called me the next day and said, "You're not overreacting. You're underplaying it. If this were anyone but your family, you'd already be suing them." I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I didn't even respond to my mother's latest text, something about how families sometimes make difficult decisions for the greater good. Instead, I called the lender back, this time requesting to place a formal consumer statement on my file, noting that I do not consent to any applications using my name, data, or digital credentials, and that any attempts to represent me in financial documentation without direct contact should be considered unauthorized and potentially fraudulent. Because this wasn't about being difficult. This was about being done. And if they thought I was just going to keep quiet while they buried the truth under phrases like helping family and doing your part, they were about to find out what it looks like when the one person they always counted on to stay quiet finally decides to speak in documents, not emotions. By the time I finished assembling the last round of evidence and had it backed up in 3 separate cloud folders, one in my personal drive, one in an encrypted archive, and one quietly sent to Sandra with the subject line, "If anything happens, start here," I had reached a state of calm that was unfamiliar but oddly empowering, the kind of calm you don't feel when you're trying to be polite or keep the peace, but the kind that sets in when you know the rules, you know the game, and you're no longer afraid of what happens when you stop playing along. I didn't feel angry anymore, at least not in the way I had earlier, when my hands shook and my voice cracked and I kept trying to rationalize things that were clearly irrational. Instead, I felt focused, like someone who had finally walked out of a fog and could now see every lever, every pattern, every passive-aggressive manipulation for what it was, and more importantly, I could finally see a way out that didn't require a scene or a fight or even a raised voice. So I made a plan. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even complicated, but it was precise and airtight and impossible to ignore. I scheduled a meeting with Sandra, who by this point had reviewed my files, flagged 6 legal violations, and called the forged signature criminal, not just unethical. And together we drafted a document that was about as far from an emotional outburst as you could get. No accusations, no family drama, no colorful language. Just terms. Cold, clear, reasonable terms that protected me and put them in a position where any refusal would look like an admission that they had, in fact, done exactly what I suspected. The document was 3 pages long and covered everything, a formal declaration that I was not involved in any past or pending financial obligations on Tyler's behalf, a clause stating that my name, credit, and digital identity were not to be used in any application, agreement, or collateral process without my direct written consent, and most importantly, a promissory note, to be signed by both of my parents, acknowledging the diversion of my college funds and agreeing to repay the amount, plus minimal interest, in monthly installments over a 5-year period, with payments starting immediately. I didn't demand interest to punish them. I added it because Sandra said without it, the agreement could be interpreted as a gift, and I wasn't giving them that out. I had the documents printed, notarized, and bound in a simple folder, nothing flashy, nothing accusatory, and dropped it off at their house without ringing the doorbell. I left a note that said, "I'm not angry, but I'm not available to be used anymore. This is my line. If you respect it, we can rebuild something eventually. If not, you'll hear from Sandra." That was it. No more texts. No more calls. Just legal, adult clarity. 2 days later, I received an email from my father. It was brief and carefully worded, but what stood out wasn't what he said, something about being surprised and hurt and needing time to review the materials. It was what he didn't say. He didn't deny it. He didn't say, "This is a misunderstanding," or "How dare you accuse us of this?" He didn't challenge a single fact, which told me everything I needed to know. That same afternoon, I followed up with the lender again, this time requesting an official flag be placed on my credit profile with their institution, noting that my data had been used without consent, and attaching a copy of my signed fraud affidavit along with the letter Sandra helped me write. I also filed an updated report with the FTC, just to keep the chain of documentation current, because if Tyler or my parents tried to claim this was all a miscommunication, I needed a timestamp trail that showed I had taken every step to prevent this, and that any continuation of the loan process would be not just dishonest, but provably malicious. Later that week, I received a notification that the loan application had been paused pending compliance review, which was lender speak for, "We're investigating fraud, but we're not going to say it out loud yet." I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just forwarded the notice to Sandra, archived the original loan packet, and updated my file names to include the word "closed." But of course, they didn't let it end there. The next morning, I received a long email from my mother, not addressed to me directly, but copied to every family member in her address book, including cousins I hadn't seen in years, as if she were staging a public defense before I could even decide whether to respond. The subject line was, "When family loyalty breaks," and the body was a carefully constructed guilt bomb wrapped in sugary language about unity, forgiveness, and being there for each other, with a few passive-aggressive jabs about how not everyone understands what sacrifice looks like. It ended with, "We still plan to proceed with the signing tomorrow, and we hope you'll show up to support your brother. He's been through so much." The audacity was almost impressive. I didn't reply. I didn't correct her. I didn't warn her. Instead, I printed a second copy of my compliance flag, printed the email she'd just sent, which included language admitting they planned to proceed despite knowing I had not given consent, and brought the packet with me to the lender's office in person. I didn't dress for battle. I didn't storm in with a speech. I just walked in, asked to speak with Anita, and calmly handed her the folder with everything she needed to close the case. Her eyes scanned the pages, and I could tell the tone of the meeting shifted immediately. She didn't ask me any questions. She just said, "We'll take it from here." By the time I walked out, I knew the deal was dead. There would be no loan. No house of cards propped up with my name. No more pretending this was about love and loyalty. And as I stood outside the glass doors of that office, looking at my reflection, I didn't feel angry or betrayed or even victorious. I felt done. And that, for the first time in years, felt like freedom. There's something almost surreal about sitting in a room that was designed to corner you, only to realize that, without raising your voice or breaking a single rule, you've quietly removed every weapon they thought they had. And now they're the ones fidgeting under the weight of their own assumptions, pretending they're still in control while the entire structure of their plan collapses in slow motion around them. That's exactly what it felt like when I walked into the signing room that morning, the same room where they thought I would sit, smile politely, and sign away my financial future to fix a mess I didn't make. I arrived exactly on time, not a minute early, not a minute late, and when I entered, Tyler was already seated at the end of the conference table. tapping his pen on the folder with that irritating rhythm that used to drive me crazy when we were kids, and he'd do it just to get under my skin, because even then, he knew he could push me further than anyone else and never face a consequence for it. My parents were there too, of course, my father trying to look stoic and businesslike, flipping through pages he didn't understand, and my mother alternating between tight-lipped silence and the occasional sigh. Like this was all just an inconvenience she was too noble to complain about. The loan officer, Anita, entered a moment later, and although her face remained professionally neutral, I caught the subtle glance she gave me, not hostile, not overly warm, just measured and aware, like someone who knew exactly what this meeting really was. I sat down without greeting anyone, placed my own folder on the table, and said, very calmly, "Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things, just for the record." No one interrupted me, not because they respected me, but because they didn't know what I was about to say, and I think a part of them hoped I was finally surrendering, that maybe all their pressure, all their guilt, had worked. But instead of giving them what they wanted, I slowly opened my folder, slid a copy of the fraud affidavit across the table to Anita, followed by a printed email chain documenting my refusal to sign, then laid down the second lien property record, the notarized promissory note my parents had ignored, and finally, the quietest but sharpest cut, the gift letter signed by both of them, which clearly stated the house was given with no expectation of repayment and no shared financial responsibility. That was the moment the shift happened, and I watched it in real time. Tyler stopped tapping, my mother's breath caught in her throat, and my father leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around the armrest like he was trying to grip some version of authority he no longer had. Anita didn't say much, she didn't have to. She flipped through the pages with slow precision, confirming the time-stamped emails and identity theft documentation, then closed her folder with a soft thud and looked directly at Tyler. "This application is no longer viable," she said, in that calm, regulatory tone that strips all the drama out of a situation while delivering the deepest cut. "Due to discrepancies in the provided documentation and unauthorized use of personal information, we're discontinuing the process effective immediately." She gathered the papers, stood up, and left the room with a polite nod, leaving us in the thick, humid silence of a plan that had just died in front of its creators. Tyler muttered something under his breath, something about how I always had to make things difficult, but I didn't even look at him. I stood, straightened my folder, and said one last thing before walking out. "If you try this again, with anyone, I'll escalate it to criminal. This time, I let it go with paperwork. Next time, it's court." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, and I didn't apologize, not for ruining their day, not for embarrassing them, and certainly not for refusing to be sacrificed one more time on the altar of their family narrative. 3 days later, I received an unexpected email from Sandra with an attached scanned copy of a signed and notarized version of the promissory note we had drafted weeks earlier. It wasn't accompanied by any apology, no explanation. Not even a message from my parents, just the signed agreement and a transaction confirmation for the first repayment, transferred directly into a separate account I had set up under a new name with no shared access. It wasn't generous. It wasn't kind. But it was what I had demanded, and they knew I wasn't bluffing anymore. That payment, as modest as it was, wasn't just money, it was acknowledgement. It was the first time in my life they admitted, in writing and in action, that what they had done was wrong, that I wasn't overreacting, that my future wasn't some optional side quest they could postpone or absorb into Tyler's journey. And while it didn't undo the years of silence, or the lies about the college fund, or the way they looked at me like I was selfish for wanting what had already been promised, it gave me closure in the form I needed most: contractual, indisputable, and irreversible. A few months later, I closed on a modest duplex in a quiet part of town, nothing flashy, nothing to post about, just a solid, practical property that I could afford without debt because I'd kept my credit clean, saved quietly, and refused to be dragged into someone else's crisis. I didn't invite anyone to the signing. I didn't send photos. I didn't make a toast. I just signed my own name once, clearly, without pressure or pre-filled fields, and walked out with keys that were mine and mine alone. And as for my family, I sent one last message, not angry, not emotional, just factual. It said, I am no longer available for shared financial obligations. Any attempts to involve me in future decisions must be in writing and cleared through legal review. This is my boundary. It is not a discussion. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. Tyler never sold the house, but I heard through a cousin that he refinanced with a cosigner from his girlfriend's family, someone who hadn't yet learned what it means to be useful until it costs you. I didn't reach out. I didn't warn her. Because it's not my job anymore to save people from the patterns they refuse to break. And if that makes me cold, or heartless, or bitter, so be it. Because the only signature that mattered in the end was the one that said I was done.